Hi, everybody. Yeah, all right, you're awake this morning. Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to all of you guys for being here. I'm really excited today and a little bit nervous because my wife is here and my 2 kids are here, and it's the first time my kids are seeing me talk. Hi, Sita. Hi, Charlotte. They're just hanging out back there. If you guys want to say hi to them, you can say, actually, everybody say hi. Hello. Awesome. Well, this is Henry Ford. Henry Ford is an American staple. Henry Ford in 1907 decided, when cars were really expensive, when they were only for the rich, only for the famous, when they were a luxury, he decided that he wanted to bring the motor car to the great multitude. He had a vision that everyone should have an automobile. So 6 years later, he decided, and he worked on it, and he created the first moving line assembly. This was a pretty novel invention. This was something that only he was doing at the time, and he decided to do it for a couple of reasons. Because he had this great vision that he wanted everyone to have a car. He wanted poor people to have a car. He wanted rich people to have a car. He wanted affluent people to have a car. This was his vision. And so he created the first moving line assembly, and he created it for a couple of reasons. One of the things that he wanted to do was he wanted to reduce prices of a car. Like I said, it was only for rich people. They were also really hard to maintain and really expensive to make. The next thing that he wanted to do was he wanted low-skilled laborers to replace skilled craftspeople. That was one of the reasons that cars were so expensive, was that it required really, really expert people in order to make. So he figured that if he could replace those people with low-skilled laborers, then he could reduce the price of a car. The next thing that he found was that if he brought the work to the workers, as opposed to the workers going to the work, they could spend less time moving about and he could gain more efficiencies. So that was another way that he was able to reduce prices, to bring the motor car to the great multitude. And the last thing that he discovered was that well-paid workers would put up with dull work and still be loyal. So he could have these people that, as long as he paid them really well, they would enjoy making this kind of dull, monotonous process. And these were some of the staples in the assembly line. For the time, it was pretty novel. Years later, we actually build our agencies around this model. Now, if we look at this list, why do we as designers and developers and content strategists and architects and all of those things, why do we use a system that's designed to do all of these things? I mean, last I checked, we don't really want to reduce the prices of our work. We want our clients to pay us really well for the things that we do. We don't want to replace ourselves with low-skilled laborers. Right? We are skilled craftspersons, and we want to be able to bring value to the people that hire us. We don't bring work to the workers. Like, how many people have ever used the throw it over the fence analogy, right? We scorn that. We don't appreciate that as part of our craft, but this is what the assembly line is based on. And the other thing is, even though we get paid really well to do what we do, there's not an amount of money that would get us the satisfaction of doing what we do. So we've got this antiquated model of the assembly line, which worked really well for cars and worked really well for commoditizing something that was a luxury item. And yet we build our luxury items, we build our value around the system. I think there's got to be a better way than that. Look at this photo. There are 3 spoilers in this photo on this car. There's 2 spoilers. Everybody familiar with the concept of spoiler? Right? Okay. So there's 2 spoilers on the back of this Corvette pickup truck thing, and there's also one at the very top of it. Well, I'm going to add a 4th spoiler to this slide. I don't think we're very far off. So although I started with talking about this antiquated method, I don't think we're far off in the things that we're doing. I think that we know what value we bring for our clients and for our bosses and for our customers. I think and this idea of responsive design is bringing up a lot of great things that are making us rethink what we're doing, but I don't think we're very far off. So don't worry, this is a feel-good talk. I'm not going to make you feel bad. Hopefully I won't make you feel bad. We're not far off. So what I want to do in this talk, I just want to share a couple of tips and tricks and stories and just tell you about some projects that I've worked on where I've failed at a few things and succeeded at a few things, and hopefully you can get something out of that experience. So the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of a framework. So we talk a lot about process, right? We talk a lot as an industry about we do this and this and this and this and this, and we talk about building processes that suit our clients. That's always been an idea that just never sat well with me. So rather than thinking about processes, what if we thought instead about frameworks? And this is what I mean. How many people are familiar with Newton's Cradle? We've seen this a few times. This is a process, right? You pick up one of the balls, you let go. It is a predictable, controlled system. There's nothing surprising about it. It's very efficient, and we know exactly how it works. This is a process where we perform a task, and the rest of it goes as planned. By contrast, this is a framework. So this is a football field or a soccer field, depending on where in the world you're from. And there are rules around the system. Everybody knows where out of bounds is. Everybody knows where the half line is. Everybody knows where the goals are. In this game, there's 90 minutes, and you shoot a ball into a goal, and you score points. It's a pretty simple game, and there are rules there. However, what happens within those 90 minutes, that's always surprising. That's where star players emerge. That's where trick plays emerge. That's where it's a very entertaining thing to watch. So this is a framework where you can introduce some surprise, although it is a controlled environment. So that's the way that I like to think about what we do on the web is how can we create better frameworks that allow for innovation, that allow for surprise, that allow us to do things that are exciting both to us and to our clients and to our customers while still kind of maintaining the boundaries of what we need to know, of what our constraints are. A friend of mine, Simon Lindsay, is a great developer. He tweeted one day, "Throughout my career, developers are never in UX/design review meetings. Why is that? We have a lot to contribute." And another friend of mine, Chris Willett, who's a user experience designer, he tweeted back and he said, "Because you need to be focusing on the build that we overpromised to the client / cut into your timeline." It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek response, but it's actually pretty true. It's actually, that happens. How many people have experienced this, right? Yeah, the builders don't get invited into meetings because they're the builders. They're not the idea people. And I think that's pretty weird. I think it's pretty odd. I think developers and designers and content strategists and the people that make things should be invited to every meeting where we're creating things because the value is not just what we do with our hands, it's what we do with our brains. So everyone needs to be involved in that ideation process. As an industry, we generally use kind of a traditional waterfall model. How many people work at a place that works kind of waterfall? Yeah, a few of us. And we say as an industry, we rally and we say like, no, let's move to Agile. Let's do everything Agile. And while it's a great theory, it's actually pretty hard to do in practice. Right? It's hard to take an established culture and say, cool, one day we're just going to snap and turn around and we're going to do something that's completely different than what we've been used to doing, and everything's going to be fine. So what I've got here is just a quick framework for you, Waterfall to Agile and 6 easy payments. And what I'm suggesting here is don't just go all in. If you're in a waterfall shop that wants to move towards Agile, don't just go all in and just try to do Agile on your next project. Try to take these steps maybe one by one. On your next project, maybe move to something different. And then the next project after that, move to step 2. So I'll show you kind of a framework for how you take a traditional waterfall process and how you move it into Agile. And the point of that, the reason I want to talk about that is because once we know how to work, then we'll know how to work within that framework. But if we don't know how to work, it's going to be kind of messy. So here's a couple of tips that I found. Traditional waterfall looks like this. And does anybody out there have a project management degree or anything like that? Oh, a few people. All right. Well, I was going to make some stuff up, but that's fine. I can try to do this traditionally. So this is kind of a traditional Gantt chart in a waterfall process. And you see one thing, let's say user experience, has to finish before another thing can start. If that phase of a project is not finished, we can't move on to design because we need those as dependencies. Then after design is finished, we moved on to development. Now, obviously, there are more things in a web design process than these 3, but I'm sort of simplifying a little bit. Now, in traditional project management methodology, these rows are called swim lanes. And when you think about swim lanes, right, you think about something like this, and it's actually designed to be a race, right? So everyone's working by themselves. It's a single track thing, and you race to the finish. So this process that we talk about collaboration and we talk about working together is actually designed to race each other. If you think about other constructs like this, we have something like this, right? This same idea. You've got these lanes, you've got these tracks, and everyone is on their individual path, not really worried about anybody else other than to see if they're beating them. And what you actually see in this kind of process is, sometimes you've got the IA that's out in front, and, good luck, suckers, done my wireframes, on to the next project. And then the designer is just not far behind, but just worried about how stylish his uniform is. And then you've got the developer that's like, what's happening here? No one invited me to this? And we use these ideas of swim lanes and tracks. They're actually races. And so that's why this process doesn't really work well when we talk about things like responsive design. It's really dependent on parties working together, and designers and developers and IAs and content strategists, and all these people kind of doing a little bit all at the same time. So how do we move that? One of the things I suggest is, if you go back to the waterfall process, on each phase, for each person's role, just extend just a little bit past what you normally do. So a user experience designer, just extend just a little bit into where the designer's starting their work. And designers start a little bit earlier than you might, and developers start a little earlier than you might too. And what happens is you create these really great areas of overlap. Right? So the user experience and designer are working more closely together because they're on the same project at the same time, and the designers and developers are working. And these periods of overlap are really, really valuable because that's where you start getting all of this fresh thinking going. So that's kind of step number 2. So rather than like a traditional race, think of it more of like a relay race. You're handing the baton over to somebody else. In a relay race, there's a point where both runners are running at the same time in parallel. Right? It's not that the one races up to a line, hands off the baton, and the other one takes off. They both have to run. As one decelerates, the other accelerates. So this period of overlap is, I think, a great metaphor for a new framework for how we should do our work. Once you've got that down, it's not that difficult to just extend time a little bit more. So user experience designers, stay on the project a little bit longer. Designers, start a little bit earlier, end a little bit later. Developers start even earlier. And what starts to happen is you get this great area of overlap where everyone on the project is working together. And you get user experience designers influencing developers, and developers influencing designers, and everybody kind of mixing their ideas into the pot. Once you've got that, elongate even more, right? It's not going to take that much more effort. And then what you start to find is maximum involvement on projects. Everybody's involved. Everybody's there. Everybody can put their ideas into meetings. Everybody can put their ideas into brainstorming, and everyone's in charge of both ideas and execution. Now, what I've just suggested here, for any of you that work at agencies or work anywhere that bills hourly, basically what I've just suggested is that you triple your rates. That doesn't work so well with hourly billing. Mostly that's why I advise against hourly billing, but that's a separate topic completely. Come find me if you want to talk about billing, because I could talk about that forever. This is a little bit more realistic, right? So rather than everybody being full-time on every project, that causes burnout. So instead, start to create this appropriate tapering, right? Where you've got this strip of everybody at heavy involvement at the beginning of a project. That's brainstorms, that's meetings, that's kickoff with client, that's internal kickoff. That's everyone being able to be valuable right up front. And then taper appropriately. So the developer might have light work up front. That might be starting to set up a CMS. That might be starting to prototype some codes or some interactions. User experience design is usually a bit more front heavy, and then towards the end of the project, you taper off a little bit more. So create this appropriate tapering around your projects where everybody's involved at the right times, but doesn't need to be full on, full blast. Now, this is a great step because this is where you start to transition into Agile. The next step, step number 5, is you've got this period of heavy involvement. And what starts to happen is now you can move toward things. You start and end together. So I like to call this idea focal points, where everybody starts in the same place and everybody ends in the same place. When you start with a brainstorm or a kickoff or something that gets you all together, bringing ideas out to the room and to the team. Then everybody does what I call and it's not just what I call, but what a lot of people call divergent thinking. So everybody kind of goes in their own directions. User experience designers might explore one way, developers might start doing prototypes, designers might start doing comps or sketches or something like that, where everybody is encouraged to explore very different things. And then at some point in your project, you start to converge all of that thinking. So a sketch that the designer makes might influence a prototype might influence something else, a piece of research might influence some design, and you start to converge all of these ideas into a time that gets everybody together at the end. So that you could think of that as, say, kickoff at the beginning of a project and launch at the end. Everybody's together at kickoff, everybody's together at the end. In the middle, you're encouraged to kind of do your own thing, figure out, explore, and then use all that exploration to influence everybody else. Now, if you think about this as like a 6-month project or a 9-month project or however long your project takes, you could take that same framework and just condense it. So rather than kickoff and launch, just think about it as you're starting something and you're shipping something. Now that could take 6 months, that could be an entire website, or it could be a deliverable, or it could be a sprint, or it could be 1 week's worth of work. So once you start to get in that mindset, now you can take these ideas and start them with some divergent thinking and effort, and end them with convergent thinking and effort. And you can take that process and you can just rinse and repeat it. So you take that and you just put a bunch of those things together. And that is how you get sort of from waterfall to agile. This idea of start and ship and start and ship, if you get within all of these phases, this idea of divergent thinking and convergent thinking could really help you along. So that could be some examples of that. That could be writing a creative brief, could be one sprint, where everybody starts together, brainstorming together on a creative brief, everybody does divergent thinking, and then convergent thinking leads to the outcome of shipping or delivering a creative brief. Or what about starting a site structure or creating a homepage or tweaking an article page? It could be tweaking, it could be creating new projects, but once you've got this framework down, now you can apply it to any piece of your project, long or short or however you need to. And that's how you get. And basically what we've described here is a traditional agile process, where there are these short amount of bursts where everybody starts together and ends together. Make sense? Everybody with me? All right, you look great. Now that we know how to work, right, that's one recommendation on how to kind of move frameworks into place or set frameworks if you don't have one. Let's look at what we should do within those frameworks. What are the literal things? So what I have here is a proposal for a modern web design process in 4 easy payments. I don't know where I got this payment thing. I just sort of stuck, and I don't know. So the first piece of the framework, one of the things that I like to do most in a project is just plan. I think we don't spend enough time planning. I think if we spent more time planning, the rest of the stuff would be easy. So I like to spend some time planning, thinking, just sort of ruminating or meditating upon ideas. The first piece of planning for me is just doing research. So one of the projects that I'm working on right now, I'm pretty lucky to have Jennifer Brooke on the project. How many people know Jennifer Brooke or know of her? If you don't, oh man, you're missing out. She's a great user experience designer and researcher and architect, and we're working on a project together. And one thing that we did on this project, it's for a magazine redesign, and this magazine is a print magazine that wants to really revamp their website. They understand that they really need to move into digital and do it in a pretty compelling way and in a big way, and so they're asking for our help to do this. One of the things we did, going into the kickoff meeting, right, a lot of people use kickoff meetings to sit down, we're blank slates, tell us everything we need to know. Well, one thing that we did before the kickoff meeting is we just talked to a bunch of readers of the magazine. And we asked them, well, what do you like about the magazine? Really informally, what do you like about the website? Do you ever visit the website? And these people are magazine loyalists, so they really enjoy the brand. And some of them use the website a lot, some of them don't use it at all. But we just asked them, we sat down, we talked to them. And it was really easy to compile a 40-page deck that just says, here's a bunch of things that we learned about your reader. For example, the primary reader of the magazine is female, so we put the deck in that context, and we just came to the kickoff meeting with a PDF, and we just ran through some of our findings. She likes to search and browse at the same time, so they're not different things to her. That was one of the insights that we brought to the table. She has an emotional context. That's the way that she described the way that she reads the magazine. She's obsessed with Pinterest. What could we do with Pinterest? She sees commerce as a service. So one of the things about this magazine is that they recommend a lot of products in the magazine, but you can't go to the website to buy them. And every single reader that we talked to said, could you guys just offer products? That's millions of dollars that they're leaving on the table by not offering products on the site, and they never really cared to ask their readers if they wanted that. Everyone we talked to said, could you please sell us stuff? Navigating the navigation, that was one thing that we found. Everyone that we talked to, I think we talked to about 14 people, every single person said, I don't use the nav on the site. I just search, I just click around on articles. Right? Those are things that we could talk about at the kickoff meeting, and we just did this by talking to a few people for about half an hour each. Very informal, not formal at all, no process. I think we gave out like $25 Starbucks gift cards, and we were armed with all this research at the meeting. One of the things that I loved about working with Jennifer is that she always asks me to hypothesize. And what she says to me often when we work on projects is she says, I want you, as somebody who's been doing this for a long time, somebody that has instinct and intuition about what people want on the web, tell me what you think should be on the site. Just devoid of research. Tell me what your vision is for the site. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to find research that supports that. Now, if I can't find research that supports that, I'm going to come back to you and say, actually, I found research that says we shouldn't do this thing. How amazing is that for a designer to say, here's what I want to do with the site. It's going to like when you go to the site, it's going to have doors that animate open, and you enter the doors and you fly through on a spaceship. And what if we found research that supports that? Amazing. But if we don't, now I'm armed as a designer to say, okay, this is actually what we found. How can I design a better experience around what we found? So I think that's one thing that we don't do enough as an industry. We don't hypothesize. You know, a lot of us, the people that are in this room, all of you guys, you're in this room for a reason. You're in this room because you want to learn, because you already know a lot about what you do and what we do as an industry, and you want to learn how to do that better. I think we should take more guesses. Let's validate that stuff with research, but don't be afraid to take some guesses and say, you know, with my experience, with what I know about people, I think we should make this. I think that's going to be valuable to our customers and to our consumers, and then find the research to back that up. So don't be afraid to hypothesize. Ready for step number 2? All right, step number 2 for me is inventory. I like to do inventorying. So now, I'm a designer by trade. I haven't talked about Photoshop yet. I haven't talked about designing yet. That comes way later. And that stuff is easy if you do all of this stuff. So I'm going to share with you a couple of different types of inventory that I've really enjoyed doing. The first is a content inventory. Now again, I'm a designer. What do I know about content inventories? Has anybody read this book, Elements of Content Strategy by Aaron Kassane? Fantastic book by the A Book Apart series. If you haven't seen it or read it, I really encourage you to pick it up. It's a really great book on content strategy. And Aaron gives a framework for how we can create content inventories. So she says, you're going to create an extremely detailed sitemap that represents every page and other piece of content on the website you're working with, along with every other piece of existing content that may end up on the site but that lives elsewhere. For each piece of content, an inventory generally lists, and she says, some suggestions: a title, a format, a URL, a content type, and an owner. That's a pretty simple framework. Now, anybody can do that, right? You don't have to be a content strategist to do that. One of the projects I worked on 2 years ago was a project for Reading is Fundamental. Has anybody heard of Reading is Fundamental? Okay, a few people. Has anybody heard of Reading Rainbow? Okay, yes, thank you. So Reading Rainbow is a really great TV show in the US that just encourages kids to read. It's, they recommend books, and it's just a really fun show about reading. And Reading is Fundamental is kind of the organization behind that. And what they do is they have got a really great mission, and it's pretty simple. Give books to kids who have never had books. One of the things that they found in their research is that low literacy is tied to social injustices like poverty, like low income rates, like welfare, like all of these things in underdeveloped communities are tied to low literacy. Incarceration, so all of these things are tied. And one of the things that they found is the more they increase literacy in an area, the better that community becomes. The government pays less welfare to that area. Income rises in that area. Education rises in that area. The community's more well off. So they have a really simple mission, which is just raise money, buy books, give books to kids who have never had books. I run a design studio called Super Friendly, and what we do there is we use what's called the Super Friend model. I don't have any employees. Everybody that I work with is a partner, and I bring those partners on for each project that I work on. Now, what I can do and what I love about that is that I can get the best of the best people to work on the projects with me. It's not just the people that are on payroll, it's the people that if I need a content strategist that specializes in doing kids research under the age of 11 at night who have mustaches, I don't know, I can get that person. And you might have heard this model before. It's sometimes referred to as the Hollywood model. It's also referred to as the Avengers model, or the Sailor Moon model, or the Ocean's 11 model, or the Voltron. I mean, you get the idea. So for Reading is Fundamental, this was the team of super friends that I had on the project. Now, I bring this up for one reason. And what you see here is I've got Kevin Hoffman worked on information architecture for Riff, Josh Luciano was my design apprentice, Noah Stokes led development, I was in charge of creative direction and design, and Matt Cook was the producer. Now, the reason I bring this up here is, notice, no content strategist. So Kevin Hoffman, really, really great person, super intelligent, can do content strategy, but he wouldn't ever bill himself as a content strategist. Now, nobody here, I think everybody on this team could do content strategy, but none of us are officially a content strategist. So for us, we needed to do content strategy on the project. We knew that that was important, but none of us really knew how to do it officially. So what we did was we just used this really simple framework for content strategy, one that Aaron recommends. This is an Excel document that was published by Adaptive Path in 2002. And Jeff Veen, who was at Adaptive Path at the time, basically said, here's a really simple framework for how you can audit a website. List all of the pages on the site, assign a number to them, and just say what the page should do. That's it. Just say, the home page should orient users to the primary mission and help people quickly find compelling content. That's pretty easy. The Books for Kids page, understand what Riff does. And so we just did this really simple framework for the project. Now, if you have the budget to hire a content strategist, even if you don't have the budget to hire a content strategist, find the budget and hire somebody. If you can't do that, there's no problem with doing it guerrilla style. Do it yourself. Here's a really simple framework, content strategy for dummies. And this is the way that we approach the Riff project and other ones where we don't have a content strategist. Add, edit, remove. Look at every page on your site, figure out, should you remove that page, should you edit that page, or should you add a new page to the site because some content is not represented. So what we did was we just, next to each page, we said, we should remove this one. Or this page is sort of good, but it needs a little bit more content that describes something else. We're going to edit this page. And what we did was we actually ended up with a gigantic spreadsheet that had all these extra columns. So we've got primary content modules and recommended URLs and templates and blah, 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 blah. And what we found was the client was like, I like this version better because I understand it more. So sometimes we as designers and developers and everything, we complicate things, right? We complicate our frameworks, and our clients are like, I guess that's fine. But what I found is that really simple frameworks tend to be better because we can make them easier, we can understand them more, and our clients can understand them more. So when in doubt, use a really simple framework for what you're going for. The other kind of inventorying that I like to do is a performance budget. That's a really great kind of inventory. I'm working on a new project now for an organization called Radio Free Europe. Are you guys familiar with Radio Free Europe? If you're not familiar with Radio Free Europe, they're a really great organization. They report the news in countries where free press is banned or where a government's not fully established. And so what they do is really, really important because there are certain areas of the world where accessing the news from this site or from any site will get you put in jail or killed. They have reports of people that have been hanged just for accessing their website. We're doing an open redesign for them, and it's a really important mission for them and for us. So we're blogging about the whole process as we're doing it. That's the URL. You can sort of check it out from there. But what we're doing for them is really important because there's certain places in the world where people are only accessing their content on mobile phones that are at a 2G speed max. So we've got to make sure that those pages load in 2 seconds or under because they're accessing them through proxy servers and because it's actually illegal for them to access this content. So for this project, performance, I mean for any project, performance is key, but for this project, it is a major, major thing that we're keeping in consideration. The open redesign, you can see at that URL. We've got a couple of posts up there already. This is Kim, who's the design director. She just sort of gave an overview of the project. We've got a couple posts on there already. Tim Cadlick is working on the project as a developer. He wrote about empathy and connection speeds. And Cradle is a designer there, and he wrote about the responsive image techniques and how just debunking a bunch of them for how they could work with Akamai and how they could work sort of on the server and on the client and how he actually deals with this stuff. So we're trying to write about all the things that we're finding as we're tackling this aggressive project. The super friend model on this project is pretty small. I'm doing all the creative direction design, Tim Cadlick is leading the development, and Matt Cook is a producer. One of the things that Tim did right away, right out of the kickoff meeting, was he created a performance budget. And I think, how many people have heard of the idea of performance budget before? Okay, a few of us. So basically what a performance budget says is we are going to take all the things that need to be on the page, and we're going to say how quickly they should load. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but that sort of does justice to the idea. And we're basically going to say this page needs to load in 4 seconds on a 3G connection. And we can actually translate that to a kilobyte weight. And we could say, so that means we've got about 800K to play with. And if we have 800K, how many web fonts can we load? How many images can we load? How heavy should the HTML be? How many style sheets can we attach? How many JavaScript libraries can we attach? And we can have these conversations with ourselves and with the client about, okay, you guys want to add another image. That means we need to take away a web font if you want the site to load in 4 seconds. Oh, you want to have them both? Okay, that means our budget moved up to 5 seconds. So now we can have a really tangible idea of how the site should perform given all the requirements that we have. So rather than just saying, rather than like getting to the end and the client goes, it's really slow, what can we do to speed it up? And we say, well, kill some web fonts. No, we don't want to kill web fonts. Load less images. No, we have to have all those images on the page. What do we do? So as a designer, again, this is really great for me because I don't have to get to an end of a project and then decide what to take out, right? It's sort of the mobile first of performance, right? We could start with all of the things that we need and build a budget based on that. So what Tim did was he just created a really quick spreadsheet and he inventoried all of the competitors of Radio Free Europe. Now, it's a news organization, so they don't really have competitors, but there are other sites that they look up to, such as the BBC, or The Guardian, or CNN, or NPR, and he basically audited all of these sites, and he recorded all of the load times using a service called Web Page Test. If you haven't seen Web Page Test is awesome. It's free. You just paste a URL in there, you click Run, and it tells you the start load times, the visually complete times, the fully loaded times. So Tim just wrote them down in a spreadsheet. And what he found was they were actually the fastest site of their competitors. So that means we don't need to do anything, right? Well, not really. What Tim found was that there's this kind of mantra that has existed since the 1960s, which is that if you want to be perceived as faster than your competitors, or you could say faster than your current site, you have to be at least 20% faster. That's the margin that you need. So basically what we're doing for our targets is, you'll see there on the right, our targets are 20% faster than the current site loads. So right now, the current site starts rendering at 3.7 seconds. We're going to shoot for 2.9 seconds. The current site is visually complete in 7.6 seconds. We're going to shoot for 6.1 seconds. So now that gives us a target to shoot for. And now we can say, okay, this is how many web fonts we can have, this is how many style sheets, this is how many JavaScript libraries, and we can build all of our things to the budget. Now, when we're critiquing a design internally before showing it to the client, Tim's asking me, how many web fonts do you have? And if I say 6, he can say to me, he can hold me accountable and say, hey man, our budget said we can only use 3. And I can use that as a design constraint as I'm designing, as opposed to way later on in the process or in the project having to figure out how to strip that back. The last kind of inventorying that I like to do is a pattern inventory. How many people are familiar with Pattern Lab by Brad Frost? Cool, awesome. So I was fortunate enough to work with Brad on the project where he kind of came up with this concept, which is the Techcrunch Project. And the basic idea is that you break down a site into these individual elements. And you could start as slow as atoms, which could be things like headings and paragraphs and things like that, and build them. And as you put together more atoms, they form molecules, and molecules form organisms, and those forms templates and pages. This idea is something that Radio Free Europe is already in love with. So when we came in, they said, well, we're really interested in using a Pattern Lab or having a Pattern Lab. So what we did was, before setting up Pattern Lab, we just made a quick spreadsheet of all the patterns. So you'll see down here, sorry, it's off the projector, but we've got tabs of atoms, molecules, organisms, presets, and missing. And what we did was we just listed all of them. Pattern Lab is pretty easy to set up, but you know what's easier to set up? A spreadsheet. And we don't need a developer to do this. So what we're shooting for on all these projects is the highest level of fidelity in the smallest amount of time. What's the thing that we can have the conversation about that doesn't require us to spend 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 8 weeks on something? So what we did was, because they were already familiar with Pattern Lab, we said, let's just list out all the patterns. So we said, here are all the atoms that we see having for the site. Here are all the molecules that we see having for the site. And we wrote a little description at the top. This is what a molecule is. And then we wrote, here are the required atoms within this molecule. And here are all the organisms. And here are all the required atoms and molecules within these organisms. And we started mapping the site this way. Now, this is not right for every client. But Radio Free Europe was one that we could have this conversation with, so we decided this was the easiest way for us to have the conversation. Now, before we get into Pattern Lab, we don't even have to revise code. We can just have discussions about this stuff. And what they did, you'll see in a couple of these slides, we've got a couple of slides with comments where they started to annotate this spreadsheet, and they said, do we really need this organism? Isn't this organism the same as this one? What about these molecules? Could we integrate them into here? And we started having this discussion about development before actually doing development. So for us, doing a really quick inventory, which took 2 hours to do, rather than taking a day to set up Pattern Lab, this allowed us to have the conversation a lot sooner and have that conversation with the client to inform our work. So all of this inventorying really just leads up to how can we best inform our work. The last type of inventorying that I do, I think I said that for the last one. This is actually the last one. The last type of inventorying that I like to do is a visual inventory. My friend Jason Santamaria, who's a great designer, he wrote a thing for the pastry box. And he said, if you want to get a better understanding of something, asking a question is infinitely more useful than making a statement. And I find that that's very, very true, at least for my work. When I started design, I have all these questions in my head. I don't know what to design yet. So I wonder about what colors I should use, or what typefaces I should use, or what the concept of the site or the app should be, or whether it should use some sort of metaphor to help drive the point home. I have all these questions. And I wrote a post about this that I call a visual inventory, which is a new deliverable that I've been giving to my clients. So when I kick off with a client, or when I at least even first hear about a project, I have all these questions like, is showing the app on a laptop on the homepage the best way to sell it to prospective customers? Right? We see that a lot. I don't know. Can the brand pull off a minimalist design approach? Maybe, I'm not sure. Should the copy on the site be more playful, or should it be professional, or what should it look like? And I don't know those things. What we do as an industry sometimes is we spend 3 weeks making 3 comps, right? 3 directions. Do you like this one, or this one, or this one? And they say, well, we like this one, and throw these 2 away. Or they say, well, we like all of them. Can we just kind of mash them together and Frankenstein the whole thing? And those are kind of weird ways to have this conversation with a client. Instead, what I've been doing, and I can do this much more quickly, is I say things like, I make a deck, I just screenshot a current website, I paste it into a Keynote file, and I just write a little piece of text next to it. How playful and whimsical should the new site be? And then I give them an example. The Hello Wallet site is full of smiles and kitschy illustrations that make you grin as you explore the site. Then I just have a little URL there. So they can click on that URL, look at the site, and then evaluate, is this really the right kind of site for us? And what I've actually started doing is I've started to Photoshop their logo into it too. Now when you look at this, this isn't really a great website for CNN, is it? But they start to see themselves in a different skin. And now we can have discussions about that. Whereas before, it would have taken me a week to do a comp that was playful and whimsical, and if they didn't like it, then that just gets thrown away. So what I do is I just take screenshots of sites, Photoshop their logo in, and then we have discussions about that. All of these things are designed to start conversations. All deliverables are designed to start conversations. The only one that's maybe not, or less so, is the final thing. So all along the way, every deliverable I make is just intended to have a specific conversation. This conversation is about art direction. So how can we have that conversation without me spending a lot of work or a lot of time? And this is something that I could turn around to a client the day after we kick off, as opposed to like, we're going to kick off, see you later in a couple weeks, so I'm going to go put my head down and work on some comps. So we can have these discussions a lot sooner. And through this visual inventory, I start to create this mental checklist, right? Like, for the color of the site, well, the client didn't respond well to flat or little color or organic textures, but they did respond well to highly saturated sites and monochromatic sites. And from a conceptual standpoint, what really resonated with them was a case study-driven site or a human-centered narrative kind of site, but not a software as a lifestyle kind of site. And then from a tone perspective, they really hated playful. That was not the right tone for them, but professional was much more appropriate. So I start to build this mental checklist for myself where I've got the constraints, I've got the inventory, even before designing. And again, as a designer, this is incredibly powerful because now I know what to design rather than like, I'll just take a bunch of guesses and then we'll throw away all the ones that aren't really worth it. The next piece of this process, there's 4, so we're on 3. The next piece of this process is sketching. Now, when I talk about sketching, I don't mean pencil and paper, although it could be pencil and paper too. But what I mean by sketching is, how do you explore ideas roughly and quickly? One way to do that is a content reference wireframe. How many people have seen this book? If you haven't, you should. This is by Stephen Hay. Stephen's over there. He's going to be talking later today, and he's going to do an awesome job. Basically, anything that he says to do, you should just do that. This is the TED site. This is a new TED site that launched. Huge, which is an agency in Brooklyn, worked on this. I think they did a really great job for the site that TED really needs. If you look at the site, if you sort of zoom out on it, it's a pretty nice site. There are a lot of great nuances in the design and the development that probably took a long time to make. It took a long time to arrive at. It probably took a long time to make. Sometimes it's hard to make responsive websites because of nuances. So one of the things that Steven suggests, and I don't know, Steven, you can talk about this later, or you can talk about it now if you want. Come up here if you want. I'm just kidding. One of the things that I like about this process of linear design is it's really simple. Again, it's simplifying that framework down. It's a simple framework for things. So what he suggests is just list out the things that should be on that page. The welcome message, the header, important callouts, tux grid, footer, all of those things. And then just block out some of those sections in gray. Now, sometimes it's really difficult to make this. Not so difficult to make this, right? You just put a bunch of boxes. You could do it in HTML. It's really, really easy. And then what I do is I just start assigning arbitrary heights to those things. Number 4 there, let's make that 800 pixels tall. Number 1, 100 pixels tall. And you start to get the relative importance of something on the page to something else, right? So if you look at number 4, the tux grid, well, yeah, it makes sense that the tux grid should be more important than, say, the header or the footer or the about section, right? If you look at the design, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because that's the main content that you want to engage with on the page. So it makes sense that that would have a little bit more space as a stereotype. And one of the things I love about this is that it's really easy to make a bunch of boxes responsive. Sometimes it's hard to build responsive sites, but it's really easy to make a bunch of boxes responsive and then start filling in those boxes. So for me, this idea is a great way to sketch. Even though it's not pencil and paper, this is a way to sketch in code. And a lot of people are really using this technique for a great purpose. There's a studio in Pittsburgh called Bearded, and this is the way that they do all their wireframes. They do them in the browser, and they send this to their client. There's another studio in Ohio called Sparkbox, and when they relaunched their site, they basically just did it all in the open, and they just started making these things. Now, it's really easy to make this, and this is not a polished design, but it's a sketch. It's a sketch of a design. It's exploring some ideas roughly and quickly. And it's easy to make this because it's easy to make gray boxes responsive. I worked on a site called Grantland, which, for those of you that aren't familiar, it's a site by ESPN where they do long-form writing about sports and pop culture. And this was the team that we had on it. And I'll just point out a couple things here. So I was working just on creative direction on the project, and I had my friend Dan Rubin, who's a great art director, working on the art direction and design. And then Kevin up in the top left and Tim sort of paired off to do their thing. So after the kickoff, Dan and I went off to explore, doing some sketching in a visual way, and Kevin and Tim went off to explore it in sort of an architectural way. And what Kevin and Tim came up with was something like this. And this is what we presented to the client. We didn't do annotated wireframe, or we didn't do traditional annotated wireframes. We just did it kind of this way. And we sent it to them in a browser, and when we called them, we said, okay, pull up this URL. And they said, well, where should we pull it up? On our phones, on our iPad, on a laptop? We said, whatever you got. And they pulled it up wherever they had. One of the people had his iPhone. One of the people on the phone had it on the projector. And we just talked about relative importance. We had a little link here for details. And when you click on the link for details, this is the annotations. Right? We just said, here's the header. The header includes these things, the logo and the search box and all these. And then we had a rationale. Here's why we think those things should go in the header. So we just took all of these and we said, here's the rationale for each of these boxes. And we let them sort of look at it in a responsive way or just pull it up however they wanted to, because the gray box part was easy. The thinking behind it, we just sort of baked into all the gray boxes. And then we started to fill those in later on. Another way that I like to sketch in a visual place is element collages. So this is something that I did for Reading is Fundamental. And when we kicked off with them, basically what we did was we just had them talk to us about their mission. One of the things that I loved about that organization is that they're so passionate about kids and getting books to kids. And so they just told us a bunch of stories about how they've done that in the past, and how they want to do it in the future. And this is my sketchbook. It's sort of combination sketches, notes, and all of that. And what I found was they started saying these words that just kept popping out at me. They started saying electric. They started saying shape, book, heart, bubble, like all of these really visual words. They started to say visual book list. They started to say pages themed in books. They started to say turn the page for step 2. All these great things that existed in my head that I just wanted to see. So what I did was, when I went home, I opened Photoshop. Yes, I said Photoshop. and I created a document that's 2,000 by 2,000. And I just started putting things on that page. Now, we didn't have architecture set, we didn't have content strategy, we didn't have anything. This was day one, hour one after our kickoff meeting. I get back home, I open my computer, and I just start to sketch. And what I wanted to do was just get ideas out of my head. So when they said turn the page for step 2, I thought of a button that flipped over. Now, I don't know if that's a good idea or a bad idea, or if it should be on the site or what, but I was like, well, what if you just roll over a button and it just like flips over like a book? Or what if you roll over it and we give suggestions for donating, like $20, $50, or you want to learn more about donations? And I don't know if these are ideas that should go on the site yet, but I'm just sketching. Visual book lists, I had a picture in my head. I just wanted to get it out of my head, so I put it on the panel. Pages themed in books. How can we play off nostalgia to get people to donate money? You know, how do we play off of their love of Goldilocks and the Three Bears or Harry Potter? And what I found was I have a lot of fun, and the client actually got a lot of value out of me turning powerful phrases into visual hooks. And so what I did after that was I just drew like a 960 grid thing on my Photoshop canvas, and I just started to place elements down that well, 960. And we did this whole project in the open, so you can see this at riff.superfriend.ly. You can see the whole process and all the design steps that we went through. And what I started to do was just put all these things here. So experiments in typography and experiments in the donation section. And I don't know if book reviews were going to be on the site, but I just, okay, let's comp up a book review and let's just see. So it's all the pieces of a website, just not a website yet. Maps and visualization around books. And this is just me exploring, me sketching. And I think this is a perfect client's reaction to an element collage. So, and this is what Riff said to me. They said, obviously this is not a website, but we see how it could be one. One of the things that's really tough about deliverables now in this responsive age, in this post-PSD age, is that we want to give something to the client that's not a moment in time. It's not a 960 website, because that's how some people are going to see it sometimes. We want to show them something that's actually detailed enough that they get the idea of the website. And what we do is sometimes we send them things that are too abstract, right? Sometimes a pattern lab is the wrong thing to send to a client because they're like, I get it, I get all the pieces, but I don't know how they fit together. So that's one of the reasons I love doing element collages, that you get to show them things in context. We did the same thing for Techcrunch, which is a technology blog. This is the team that worked on that project. And basically what we did was we just started making element collages at the same time that we were doing development work and architecture work. So being a news site, I experimented a lot with typography and what type combinations would look like. You know, I just did a ton of them. We looked at rollover states. And you know, what if we had these like big chunky buttons that you could just push and then flipped over and there was all these animations and everything was great. And we looked at breaking news items and we looked at a headline only view and started making this like gigantic tag cloud thing because I thought it would have been cool. And one of the things that I learned in doing these element collages was sometimes it actually looks like a website. So to break that up, I started to include things like hands, because those are things that you don't really see on a website. Actually, I've got this one comp, I probably should have put it in here, for a new client that I'm working with right now, where I did kind of a finger that was pushing a button, but it had like a severed hand. So I had like, I don't know, it was just kind of cut off at the wrist. I'll show you that some other time. I started looking at recirculation modules and what all of that would look like. And one of the things I love about doing projects in the open is that I get to put something out there, and then somebody else can read it and say, here's a much better way that you should have done that. And I get to value from the thing that I conceivably created. So what I did was I wrote about this idea of element collages, and Clear Left, which is a great agency in the UK, they basically said, we're starting to use element collages, and here's a bunch of things that we found doing it. So this is an element collage that they did for one of their clients, and they said the client reacted really positively to it and said, we love this, but what happens when you click the icons? So they thought it was an actual website, and I could see why. I mean, modern websites kind of look like this now. So what they started to do is they started to make their element collages horizontal. So rather than being like a really long vertical scroll, they just made it really wide instead of really tall. And they started to present them that way, and they found that their clients were actually having a better time understanding all the pieces of it. So the next project that I worked on was for Entertainment Weekly, doing a redesign for them. And basically what we did on that project was a horizontal element collage, and that worked really well for them. They understood all of the pieces, and they understood how they would be put together. The other thing that I learned in doing this one is that clients react well, and they don't think it's a website when they see multiple variations of the same organism. So what you see here is those are all the same special coverage module, but we just had different treatments on them. So do we like the caption at the bottom? Is it at the top? Should it have a border? And they got to choose from all of these things, and we just use this as kind of like a big palette for all of them. And Paul Lloyd, who's a designer at Clear Left at the time, and he's now at The Guardian, he makes element collages a lot. And basically what he said about them was like, you know when you're in Photoshop and just before you send a comp to a client, you turn off a bunch of layers? Anybody done that? Yeah, I do that. He's like, he said, it's like giving the client a peek at all those layers. And I really like that. I think if we're really collaborating with our client, we're not hiding stuff from them. We're not saying like, oh, we're only going to show you this part, because it sets up this dichotomy of us versus them. But when you're showing them all of the stuff and you say, here's some things I think work well, here's some things maybe not so well, but I want to have a discussion about it, now you're all one team. If you're interested in learning more about element collages, I wrote about it for the Riff project. You're free to visit the URL there. The last type of sketching that I like to do is prototyping. Now, prototyping is kind of a different way of thinking about sketching, right? Because we think about sketching as pencil and paper, but I think you can sketch in code too. So how do you explore ideas rough and quickly in code? We did a project for a small company. You guys probably never heard of them. You don't know. And this was a team on it. Again, a pretty lean team. And one of the things I love about working with Jamie, who's a really good friend of mine, is that he sketches in code all the time. So he's one of those people that, remember the diagram I showed of everybody starting together after kickoff meeting, everybody starts right away? There's some developers that wait for the designer to come up with what they need to start their work. Jamie doesn't. Although Jamie's a developer, he starts as soon as I start and sometimes sooner. So basically what I did was I went and I sketched this in Photoshop. Now, I didn't know what this was going to be yet, but I thought it would be interesting to kind of do a 3D explorable browser thing. What Jamie started to do was he started to sketch. So first he created a code pen, and he just started to experiment with what 3D and CSS looked like, and JavaScript. And so he just created a bunch of these figures and a bunch of CSS and a bunch of JavaScript. That was his first sketch. It took 30 minutes. And that's all he did was just make this 3D box. It didn't move. It didn't do anything. His next sketch was, if I take all that stuff out of HTML and I put it in JavaScript. So what happens if I generate all of this in JavaScript? Does it make any difference? That was his second sketch, 30 minutes. Then he moved out of CodePen, and he started to create these things, just like this. Big black area at the top of the page, one thing. And then he started doing this, which I love. He started writing these things. Initial test, scale the browser, try scaling vertically and horizontally. And he started to create these problem and solution statements, which I think is so awesome. Each prototype, each sketch had one problem to solve and one solution. And the way that he prototypes is the first prototype, the first sketch, should be something that anybody can do. Put a div on the page. And then they increase in fidelity and in complexity. Okay, what if we put 10 divs on the page? What if we put 1,000 divs on the page? What if we generate 1,000,000 divs? What happens to performance? What happens to JavaScript? What happens to CSS? What happens to all of these things? And then what starts to happen from that is any new developer that joins the project, which happens often, they can look through each of the prototype and basically catch up on everyone. Oh yeah, I know how to make a div. I know how to put 10 divs on the page. I know how to put 1,000. I know how to write JavaScript and put 1,000,000 on the page. Oh, I don't know this next one. Let me look at that. I don't know this next one, or the next one, or the next one. But they start to catch up on the project. So you start to do this like really heavily in sequence. What if I use a div in the DOM? What if this is clickable? What if we put multiple of these on the page? And now he started to introduce animation. So now these are all twirling in space. What if I put an animated GIF inside there? What if we combine 3JS, the 3JS library, with a custom CSS 3D primitive? What if we apply a texture map to this? What if we tilt it in space? What if we add a little bit of ambient sway to it? What if we use the texture from the Photoshop document? What if we made those things rolloverable? Yeah, rolloverable, okay. And what if you rolled over them and they turned in 3D space? What if we added sway and we have these things? Now, this is a key moment here, because now we have all these isolated prototypes. Once we got to that point where we've had all of them isolated, we start to put them together to see. Okay, what if we generate 1,000 divs and then we make them all sway in 3D space? What does that do to the browser? What does that do to the GPU? All of these things, we had all these experiments, and now once we have them all isolated, we start to put them together. And as you put them together, you start to create the whole site. And that's the last step in the framework, is assemble. right? We talked about all of these things about planning and sketching and inventorying. If you do all that stuff up front, it's really, really easy to just assemble them later, right? You've got all the pieces. Maybe you made a pattern lab. Maybe you did an element collage. Maybe you've got a spreadsheet that says all of the things that you're going to make. Maybe you've got a bunch of code prototypes. Maybe you've got a bunch of sketches. Once you have all that stuff, you can just assemble them and put them together. I love Hell's Kitchen. I will watch anything with Gordon Ramsay in it. How many people are familiar with this concept of mise en place? For those of you that don't know what it means, it's taking all of the ingredients that you've got and each of them having their place. Now, Gordon Ramsay really emphasizes prep in service, right? So you don't chop the tomatoes when you need the tomatoes. You chop the tomatoes ahead of time, so when you need the tomatoes, you just grab them. And he really emphasized this in service, is that service doesn't go well unless everything has their place. I think that's the way that we should approach our designs and our development. Each thing should be in their place. We should already have that stuff figured out so that when it comes time to serve it, all we need to do is put that stuff together and assemble them in the way that they need to go. So you may notice in the Radio Free Europe project, I talked about presets just for a second. For those of you that are familiar with Pattern Lab, we talked about atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, pages. Well, one of the things that we started to do for this project, and you may or may not have noticed, is we've got atoms, molecules, organisms, but rather than templates and pages, we started calling them presets. The reason that we called them presets was because the word template and the word pages have a lot of baggage. A lot of people think of templates as like, once it's there, and you can't do anything to it. And that actually goes against the idea of atomic design, right? It's kind of counterintuitive, but when you talk about presets, it's just these things that can change, right? You start with a thing, but it can change. I think one of the ways that is best described is if we look at something like this. Oops. Like this. So Instagram or Visual Supply, they have presets where you can choose a filter, but then you can modify that filter. So I kind of want it to look like this, but I want to tweak this. I want a little bit more grain, or I want a little bit more vignetting, or I want a little bit darker shadows. So I'm going to start with a thing, and then I can modify it. And that's kind of the way that we were thinking about templates instead, where you could start with a template, and you can add things to it. So what we did was we had a tab called presets, and the client said, well, we need 30 templates on the site. And we went back to them and said, we think you need one preset. That was kind of a radical idea for them. But we said, basically you need, well, I guess we ended up at two, a home page preset and an article preset, because that's basically everything on the page. And an article can have all of these possible atoms and organisms and molecules, but not every article needs all of them at the same time. So they created this spreadsheet, this tab on the spreadsheet called Missing. And they said, here are all the things all the templates that we think we need. They're missing from your assessment. They said, we need a radio archive and a TV archive and an article archive. And really, those are the only new things on those presets. The forum piece, which is commenting, and a user upload page, those are the only new things in those templates. Everything else is exactly the same. So we said, well, what if we made all of those things optional? And we said, an article preset could have a forum or a user upload page, but you don't actually need to have that. And they built their whole CMS around this concept, where organisms could be possibly inserted, and we've got a framework set up. All the CSS and JavaScript is intelligent enough to know what should happen if we include those things, but they don't need to exist every time. So we're treating it much more like filters work, rather than here's a template that you must use every single time. And for us, we had to double down on this. So from a project plan perspective, we actually built the process this way. We built the framework this way, where we said, we're going to spend some time doing element collages and figuring out what the art direction of the site's going to be. But after that, all we're going to do is design organisms. We're not going to design pages. We're not going to do full comps. We're not going to do any of those things. We're going to design the organisms and develop them in such a way that each of them can be responsive on their own, and each of them could also be rearranged on their own. So you could add a forum organism to an article page, but it doesn't have to be part of the article template. So this is not only just like a design decision, this is a business decision. From the way that we set up the actual project, we really doubled down on this. That's Ethan. That's Ethan. In 2010, he wrote an article for A List Apart where he just described a really simple framework. He talked about fluid grids, flexible images, and media queries. Now that's not really that difficult. Any developer worth their salt can probably make a site with those 3 ingredients. So responsive design isn't really that hard. But really what it is a catalyst. We talk about responsive design, and we talk about all of the difficult things about it. You're kicking me off the stage, aren't you? Okay, I'm going to go. And all of these things we start to talk about when we talk about responsive design. Availability of content, performance, accessibility, organizational change, progressive enhancement. All of these things come along with responsive design, which is what makes it a bit more complex than fluid grids, flexible images, and media queries. But this is a familiar list to us. So a lot of us have been around when this actually happened with web standards. When we started switching from table-based layouts to CSS, we talked about these same things. We talked about accessibility. We talked about workflow. We talked about business benefits. We talked about performance. All of those things happened. We're having the same conversations now. So for me, responsive design is less of a catalyst than it is more a reminder that these things are important. So sometimes responsive design it seems difficult, but other times, if you think about it as a reminder, it'll be a little bit easier to stomach. When we look at it and we look at all of these things in combination and we say, I don't know how to make the site load in 2 seconds and have all these images, and responsive images is weird, and I don't know how to deal with all this stuff, it's kind of overwhelming, and responsive design could be really hard if you think about it that way. But when you think back and think about responsive design as a reminder, and we think of it as a way that we could just build better experiences for our users, and we take all the skills that we have, the photoshopping, the sketching, the inventorying, all of that stuff, and we just tweak it a little bit, and we just think about ways to make that a little bit more efficient for us, then it's really not so hard. It becomes a little bit easier to kind of take in. Thanks so much, everyone.